Vote is ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for this full committee markup. We have a robust lineup of legislation today, starting with 4 bills that we are considering under regular order. The first is my ESA Amendments Act of 2024, which represents more than a year's worth of work from the ESA working group. Thanks to Mr. Huffman, we could say it was a bipartisan working group. He may disagree with that. But we did hear input from men and women across the country about ways the Endangered Species Act is harming their communities and how we can bring species conservation into the 21st century. There's not a person sitting here today who doesn't want America's rich abundance of wildlife to not just survive, but to thrive for generations to come. Prosperous biodiversity doesn't happen by accident. It takes careful planning, local input, and consideration of differing ecosystems and environments to ensure that every species has the necessary resources and the habitat to thrive. This was the original intent of the ESA, but after more than 50 years, the law has not accomplished its stated purpose, which is to recover species to the point that they are no longer needed to be protected. With a dismal 3% success rate of recovered species, we can safely give the ESA a failing grade. Radical environmental groups have hijacked federal regulations not to protect species, but instead to line their pockets with lawsuit profits. I've advocated for years that we need to give species management back to the men and women who know it best, and that it's our local communities. Wildlife inhabiting rural Montana, for example, has vastly different environmental and ecological needs than even the same species living in Northern California. It's just common sense that we would trust the expertise of the land managers and local communities who live and work among wildlife over federal bureaucrats that are thousands of miles away in D.C. The ESA Amendments Act will make critical reforms to the ESA to clarify definitions, establish a baseline to measure when outcomes are successful, and incentivize the recovery of listed species. Rather than allowing the law to continue acting as a political weapon for litigious groups itching to sue, settle, and pocket the profits, the act will encourage the recovery of listed species. I'm proud to be advancing this essential legislation today and look forward to a good debate on the issues. We also have 2 bills that push back on the Biden-Harris administration's attempts to ban American energy production. Congresswoman Hageman and Congresswoman Boebert's bills will prohibit the BLM from implementing draft resource management plans, which are thinly veiled efforts to reduce acres available for oil and gas, mineral development, and grazing. Rural communities depend on multiple uses of federal lands. It's insulting that this administration is so intent on destroying the Western way of life, making America weaker on the global stage and impeding our domestic energy production. Both bills will put a stop to the rogue bureaucratic extremism that has defined the Biden-Harris administration's land lockup policies, and will continue to do everything in our power to fight for balanced land management that supports local communities and America's energy and critical mineral needs. Like my ESA Amendments Act, these bills put the power back in the hands of the local leaders so they can start from scratch on resource management plans that actually uphold multiple uses and the needs of rural communities. Finally, we're considering Congressman Carter's legislation that will prevent the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration from finalizing the expanded vessel speed restriction rule first proposed in 2022, keeping the existing regulations in place. This will provide essential protections for recreational and commercial fishermen who depend on access to coastal waters for their lives and livelihoods. Each of these bills we're advancing today represent science-based, common-sense solutions to the problems we've heard from our constituents across America. I'm proud to be putting forward bills that work for and are driven by our communities, and I look forward to what I'm sure will be an energetic discussion on the issues. I yield back and now recognize Ranking Member Huffman for any statement that he may have.
Thank you, Chair Westerman. Good morning. So we are running out of time for markups in this Congress, which means I am disappointed but not surprised that Team Extreme has chosen to use one of our final markups in this chaotic, unproductive Congress to further their impressive streak of hearings that ignore the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. These should have been top priorities for this committee these past 2 years. Instead, we have a markup centered on bills that try to weaken and hamstring our foundational environmental laws, undermine science-based wildlife management, and exalt the interests of corporate polluters who damage our environment, harm our public health, price gouge American families, and evade taxes. This polluters over people agenda is right out of Trump's Project 2025. Give wealthy polluters everything they want and keep scientists and wildlife experts on the sideline. Disparage them as bureaucrats, call them the deep state. Now, back in May, we learned that big oil executives were preparing a wish list complete with ghost-written executive orders for a potential second Trump presidency. We've also heard about the infamous dinner meeting at Mar-a-Lago, where oil executives were shaken down for $1 billion contribution to a presidential campaign. Such a deal compared to the incredible benefits that they would get in policy concessions. Now, you would think our Republican colleagues, even though they support the fossil fuel agenda, would at least denounce this kind of odious behavior. But the events of the past year show that when it comes to Donald Trump and big oil, there's literally nothing that could get Team Extreme to criticize or challenge even the most egregious acts. It has been months since the committee Democrats requested an investigation into the smoking gun evidence from the FTC that big oil has been colluding with OPEC to illegally raise gas prices. They are using public lands and public resources to screw American consumers with price gouging so they can pad their already huge profits. And the silence from House Republicans is deafening. And we continue to implore Republican members of this committee to work with us. This committee has the ability to get those redacted documents from the FTC. We can find out more about what appears to be clear price gouging and collusion. But when you refuse to even look into it, it sure begins to look like you are covering it up, which begins to support an inference that you're in on the collusion and the price gouging of American consumers at this critical moment. With just a few more opportunities before this chaotic Congress comes to an end, we should be working together to stand up for the American people and confront big oil's price gouging. And instead, we're here today with a polluters over people agenda straight out of Trump's Project 2025. You know, the 920-page document written by dozens of Trump's closest advisors and allies that was praised by Trump and J.D. Vance for months, that is, until they realized that once people looked at it, it became very politically toxic, and so they started trying to distance themselves from it. Now, you can pretend that Trump's Project 2025 is just random policy spitballing from a think tank, but we all know better. We know that until just a few months ago, Republicans at the highest level were praising and embracing Project 2025. We know that Trump repeatedly tried to do many of the extreme measures in Project 2025 during his presidency, and he continues making campaign promises that closely align with Project 2025. To name just one, which happens to also align with today's hearing, Trump recently promised to eliminate the Department of Interior. Now, I can't wait to hear my colleagues explain how the ESA will be just fine when there's no more Fish and Wildlife Service, or for that matter, how the chair's bill to dismantle much of the ESA would work without an Interior Department. My colleagues and I will have more to say about this bill when we get to the debate, but the main message here is that House Republicans are staking their closing argument in this dumpster fire of a Congress that they've presided over on an agenda that is so extreme, targeting the Endangered Species Act, one of the most popular and successful environmental laws ever passed, trying to pass legislation that would condemn critically endangered species like the North Atlantic right whale and many others to extinction. Talk about extreme. This markup is a political gift to Democrats, but you will not hear us celebrating because it's not a game to us. Our planet, our wildlife, delicate ecosystems, vital to our well-being, including our economic well-being, are in serious trouble. The biodiversity of our planet, the livability of this planet for future generations hangs in the balance. Now, I hope that I've begun to check off your bingo boxes over there on the other side. A juvenile antic, but hey, if it gets you to listen, that's a start. But seriously, folks, you might be proving our point about your extremism problem if you're triggered by words like climate crisis, bedrock environmental laws, science, environmental justice, sick children, ignoring native voices, or polluters over people. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman want to submit his Project 2025 document for the
I
record?
think it's already in the record from the last hearing. If
Okay.
you like, we can.
It's pursuant to the markup notice, it is now in order to consider H.R. 9533, ESA Amendments Act. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purpose of debate on the bill? Mr. Stauber, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in strong support of your bill, H.R. 9533, the ESA Amendments Act of 2024. I want to commend you on putting forth this bill, which is a product of over a year's worth of work and engagement between members of this committee and stakeholders who are affected by and work with the ESA every day, including habitat and wildlife managers, conservation groups, sportsmen and women, individuals seeking to responsibly develop our vast natural resources, and everyone in between. The Endangered Species Act is a noble law. Over the past half century, it's helped us save and rebuild endangered and threatened species across the nation. But as we've also learned over the past 50 years, there are serious flaws in the law that we desperately need to address. I'm glad to see that the bill before us today addresses the many issues holding us back from properly managing and supporting endangered and threatened species here in the United States. First, the bill tackles resource prioritization by requiring the services to develop a national listing work plan. This will help the service properly prioritize listing and delisting actions, particularly when they are being inundated with tons of listing petitions all at once. This prioritization will increase the service's capacity to properly address each species and cut down on the number of automatic listings. This also builds upon candidate conservation agreements that help enable private landowners to work with wildlife managers to help protect species. It requires federal agencies to establish clear, objective, and incremental recovery goals that will lead to species being recovered and finally being delisted. As we all know, a listing under the ESA is akin to being stuck in purgatory. Only 3% of species have made it off the list in the past 50 years. This bill will help change that. And it finally brings some much-needed transparency to the ESA. It will require agencies to publish the data that they are using to make their listing decision and set guardrails to ensure only the best and most accurate scientific and commercial data is used to make these decisions. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you again for bringing this bill before us today, and I urge all of my colleagues to join us in supporting the bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After hearing the way this bill is being characterized, I have to wonder if we're looking at the same bill. And frankly, I'm trying to connect the dots between what's being claimed that this bill would do and what's actually in the bill. The question continues to come back to how this bill will make the ESA more effective. You got to use air quotes around the word effective here. Any reasonable definition of effective would focus on protecting listed species from extinction, putting them on a path to recovery. It would focus on making the ESA work better for wildlife and habitat, not making it easier for people and industries to harm wildlife and habitat. And this is where this bill seems to have it exactly backward. Title I delays listings for threatened and endangered species up to 12 years, forcing species to decline further toward extinction before any legal protections can kick in. Title II takes a sledgehammer to an ongoing and effective conservation program between the Fish and Wildlife Service and private landowners, one of the many ESA programs already facilitating partnerships for species recovery. Title III removes baseline protections for threatened species, fast-tracks delisting, blocks judicial review of delisting, none of which makes for incentives for recovery. Title IV creates a definition of the best available science that disregards the quality of the science in favor of cherry-picked sources. Title V limits mitigation, which is a tool that allows many projects and activities to move forward while simultaneously protecting and recovering endangered species. There's nothing in this bill to strengthen the ESA, to optimize its efficiency and effectiveness, to provide incentives for protecting and recovering listed species, or to make the process more accountable to the ESA's actual goals. I can't find anything in the bill that's actually pro-wildlife. This is simply a mashup of random, weird, and counterproductive measures that will hamstring the ESA, making it more confusing and ineffective, even removing the common sense tool of mitigation. It's as if Team Extreme asked the country's biggest polluters and developers to make a list of everything they could think of to undermine the ESA, and voila, they produced this bill. The architects of Trump's Project 2025 are smiling too, because this bill replicates many of their anti-ESA prescriptions, including taking ESA decisions away from scientists and wildlife professionals, empowering MAGA extremists to substitute their political and economic agendas for science-based wildlife management. The legislation before us today is the latest reminder that Project 2025 isn't just a plan for a potential second Trump presidency. It's an extreme agenda that House Republicans are actively advancing right now here in the Natural Resources Committee. Fish and Wildlife Service, states, the American people aren't clamoring to dismantle the ESA. It remains broadly popular, supported by 84% of Americans. It's one of the most important environmental laws ever passed. If you've ever seen a manatee, polar bear, bald eagle, loggerhead sea turtle, or any number of other threatened and endangered species, you should thank the ESA for preventing their extinction. And if you value ecosystems and wildlife, if you care about the biodiversity crisis unfolding all around us, you should join me in calling on the Republicans who have brought dozens of bills before this committee to weaken the ESA to knock it off, and to try working with Democrats on actually making the ESA stronger, better, and more effective. A serious conversation about improving the ESA would include giving agencies, states, and tribes the resources that we know makes a difference. It would include empowering Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS to list species before they are at extinction's door so that we have a better chance of saving them, more management flexibility. We know that funding the ESA also speeds up consultations and permits. And we've been discussing that with Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Fully funding state and tribal wildlife plans will help keep species off the endangered species list in the first place and speed up environmental reviews. This is a bad bill before us today. I urge my colleagues to reject it, but there is still a productive bipartisan ESA conversation waiting to happen when Team Extreme stops taking its cues from Trump's Project 2025 and anti-ESA special interests. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Mr. Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate this discussion, and I just want to back up a little bit. My friend from California noted the game of bingo last week, and the point is that everything that comes out of my friend's mouth is so predictable. It's like this market-tested phrases: Team Extreme, radical environmentalism, climate crisis, bedrock environmental laws. I mean, I want to remind my friend, you all were in charge of the Congress for decades and did nothing. Did nothing. Yet now that you're in the minority, all of a sudden all of these things come up. I mean, and it's fascinating watching the direction that's coming out of my or I guess the apparent manipulation of my friends on the other side, and that they're not even showing any independent thought. All across the entire Democrat Party, they were all told to do this Project 2025 thing, which it's already been disproven that this isn't a campaign platform for the Trump administration, which the fact that my friends across the aisle are talking about campaign platforms in Congress when we're supposed to be doing official government work is fascinating. My friends sit here and talk about how every single hearing that we have, how Republicans are the shills of big oil. The facts show that when you are in charge, when Democrats are in charge, the oil and gas companies make more money. They love y'all being in charge. They love it. They endorsed your Inflation Reduction Act because it makes them more money. Sit here and talk about, we're concerned about emissions reduction. Your strategies result in greater emissions. We're worried about protecting the environment. Your efforts to protect the environment prevent renewable energy projects from being deployed. It is amazing to me. All of the facts are crystal clear that your policies result in worse outcomes in regard to energy affordability. Look at the study that just came out by the United States Department of Labor. Maybe I should dump it in the record. That shows that your strategies result in child labor. The Biden administration's Department of Labor just released the report that your strategies result in child labor and slave labor in regard to critical mineral production. And so let's block mining in the United States, and let's instead have mining come from children and from slave labor overseas that benefits other countries' economies rather than ours. Then we can make Americans pay more for energy. Then we can have higher emissions. Then we can carry out strategies that are resulting in greater dependence upon Russian oil. Like, which of these things actually makes sense? Like, help me understand. I get to say this. You can do bingo on me. I get to say this at every hearing because you all walk into it every single time. I'll make you a bingo card for me. Your policies result in enriching Iran that then funds Hezbollah and Hamas and attacks people, including Americans, resulting in deaths. Your policies have resulted, it's been proven, and this was last year, over $60 billion in additional profits to Iran that they give to Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Then we get to fund the other side of the war? Like, this is idiotic. And then Russia's making all the money off of the energy policies. Well, again, report just came out by Politico this week showing how Russian oil is going to Turkey, getting refined, and that Russia's making out like bandits, and so is Turkey. You know who's losing? Americans. You know, the people we represent. It is absolutely incredible. And this isn't sitting here, my opinion. There are reports and facts that show all this rather than the hyperbole or trying to tie, and I don't even know what the hell this thing is, trying to tie this to me or to the chairman or whoever else. No clue what it is. Never read a page and can't name a single person, not a single person under oath, I'll say it right now, who's involved in this.
Will my friend yield for a quick question? Would you yield for a quick question?
Gosh, you know what? I always enjoy hearing you talk, but I don't know that I'm in the mood right now. So, Mr. Chairman, I just think that if we're going to sit here and continue this hyperbole through the campaign process, that's fine. But who's losing out are the American people that have suffered. And you can look at the Biden administration's own facts, statistics, and report. They have suffered as a result of these policies that my friends across the aisle are doubling and tripling down on today. I want to thank the chair. I want to thank Mr. Stauber for their leadership efforts in bringing real facts and science to the table to make sure that we're actually honoring the people that we're representing. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. You know, a lot of things have changed since 1974, a lot of it for the good. Hairstyles and clothing styles, for one thing. We've seen the end of a Cold War. We've seen a computer revolution. We've seen great advances in science and remote sensing so that we can understand our environment better. Lots of things have changed. Maybe the best thing from the 70s that's still around in some form today is the music from the 70s. It was actually pretty good. But the ESA is one of those things that really hasn't changed in 50 years. And I'm feeling a bit like a progressive today because I'm thinking we need to update the ESA for the betterment of those species that we all love and care for. And I know there's a lot of rhetoric, a lot of talk about bedrock environmental laws, but what I ask you to do is listen to what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make the ESA work. We're trying to make it what it was intended to be. It started out lots of support, and rightly so, because we were losing a lot of species. But the ESA Amendments Act of 2024 will benefit the conservation of the most at-risk species. It will provide needed transparency to our constituents and reauthorize one of the most consequential laws under our committee's jurisdiction, the Endangered Species Act. Simply put, the ESA is failing. The purpose of the ESA is to help the recovery of listed species. It's been mentioned that since this law was passed by Congress over 50 years ago, over 1,700 species have been listed, but only around 60 of these 1,700 species have been recovered. That's a dismal 3% recovery success rate over the law's 50-year lifespan. It's not acceptable. The bill prioritizes recovery in several ways. It does so by empowering states and private landowners to formulate and invest in proactive conservation activities for at-risk species. Specifically, it provides private landowners who invest in species conservation on their lands the regulatory certainty that punitive critical habitat designations will not be made on those lands. This concept is not new. This is the same process that is currently used on Department of Defense lands. In addition, this legislation gives states the ability to propose innovative recovery strategies for threatened species, giving them a formal role in the management of those species, as Congress has always intended. This legislation would also put an end to the endless cycle of litigation that has followed the delisting of certain species. It does so by giving teeth to the 5-year post-delisting monitoring period that already exists in the ESA statute by prohibiting judicial review just for this period to allow for the collection of real-world data on how a species is recovering. This legislation would also provide much-needed transparency at each stage of the ESA process, providing our constituents with the information they deserve. This includes requiring the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA to make publicly available the cost of all ESA-related litigation, as well as the science behind decisions to list species and designate critical habitat. The bill would also require an analysis of the economic effects and effects on national security concurrently with ESA delisting decisions. All of this is essential to ensuring the public to be able to know the full breadth of the impact of ESA decision-making. Lastly, the bill would take a significant step forward to streamline the ESA's role in permitting vital infrastructure projects. It does so by providing a consistent definition of environmental baseline, which includes a requirement to take existing infrastructure into account. This would prevent executive agencies from creating an arbitrary environmental baseline. Contrary to congressional intent, the Biden-Harris administration is requiring project sponsors to mitigate impacts on listed species for projects to be permitted. This new requirement violates decades of precedent, and it will ultimately increase cost while making the federal permitting process even less effective. The bill would explicitly ensure that federal agencies focus on minimizing the impacts of a proposed action as currently required by the ESA. This nullifies administrative overreach and refocuses efforts on complying with the ESA. Congress has a responsibility to provide oversight and accountability over federal agencies and the decades-old laws that they implement. By considering the ESA Amendments Act of 2024, we are fulfilling that responsibility and providing oversight. We are placing the recovery of listed species, accountability, and transparency at the forefront of ESA decision-making. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Hearing none, it is now in order to consider amendments to H.R. 9533. I recognize myself for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute designated Westerman 097 ANS. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Quite simply, my ANS makes technical corrections to the bill to clarify its intent to provide more regulatory opportunities for states to manage and recover listed species. The ideas set forward to expand state management opportunities for listed species reflect the consensus recommendation of 50 national conservation organizations as a part of the recently published Wildlife for the 21st Century report by the American Wildlife Conservation Partners. I ask unanimous consent that this report be submitted for the record. Without objection, so ordered. And I urge my colleagues to support the ANS, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the ANS?
Just this.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do not oppose the ANS going forward, but this whole premise that somehow, despite the fact that we're looking at a bill that dismantles the most critically effective protections in the ESA to save wildlife from extinction and put them on a path to recovery, that somehow the intent is to actually help wildlife Mr. Chairman, you noted that I was the only Democrat to actually sit in on your ESA working group. I did that because I knew that you would not be hearing from all of the voices out there that actually support the ESA, that don't think it should be dismantled, that think it should be strengthened. And I tried to bring that perspective into the conversations. I was dismayed that every single person that my friends across the aisle brought into that conversation was a critic of the ESA, someone who wanted to weaken it, someone who thought it was too burdensome. So, you know, look, I guess you can sugarcoat this and say that the intent of this bill is to somehow help wildlife or to help the Endangered Species Act be better. But anyone who reads it, anyone who takes a look at the industries and the agendas that have fed into this legislation we're considering surely knows better. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. If there's no further discussion on the amendment, it is now in order to consider amendments to the ANS. Recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Huffman number 1. Without objection, the amendment is considered read. Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A moment ago, I asked my colleague from Louisiana to yield for a question, and he didn't do that. But what I wanted to ask him was whether perhaps he was involved in the debate prep for Donald Trump, because it appears that he was even more easily triggered than Trump was by Kamala Harris, and I find that an interesting strategy. But looking at the amendment that I'm offering right now, you may wonder why I'm proposing to strike several large and seemingly random sections of the legislation. Here's why. Each section I'm proposing to strike in this amendment comes from Trump's Project 2025. And apologies in advance for the triggering that will surely result in. Project 2025 is a radical plan by MAGA extremists to take over the government and control everyone's lives. It goes against the will of the American people, threatening our freedoms and gutting checks and balances to consolidate power. If you spend just a few minutes reading through this far-right agenda, you'll see how extreme it is. This thing is chock full of proposals that would dismantle everything we stand for as a country and reverse decades of progress: reproductive health care, voting rights, LGBTQ plus protections, social services that millions of Americans depend on. All of that is on the chopping block, and of particular relevance to this committee and the bill before us today is how Project 2025 would eliminate vital environmental policies, defund environmental agencies, undermine the work and expertise of scientists, and open America's natural resources up to exploitation, further exploitation by special interests. The ESA Amendments Act we're considering contains policy ideas that could have been ripped straight out of the pages of Project 2025 as it speaks to the Endangered Species Act. These include bringing back Trump-era counterproductive data publication and settlement transparency policies, as well as Trump-era definitions for habitat and best available science. The poster behind me shows some of those similarities. Now, not only does this bill have a bunch of ideas from Project 2025, Team Extreme actually decided to take things even further. Project 2025 calls to reinstate the Trump rules that weaken critical habitat designation. This bill does that and also makes it impossible to designate a critical habitat that is unoccupied despite it being essential for species recovery. Project 2025 calls for a conservation triage program included in this bill, but then this bill goes further to eliminate all the existing listing deadlines and substitute them for the rolling deadlines in the work plan, pushing off species listing up to 12 years. Project 2025 uses the goals of private property and states' rights as a twisted justification for dismantling environmental laws. Well, the bill before us implements that and goes further by creating a series of carve-outs and exemptions for states and private lands to put special interests over the well-being of our natural resources. And lastly, where Project 2025 calls for the reinstatement of Secretarial Order 3349, and thus for the re-examination of mitigation policy, this bill would go ahead and entirely ban mitigation under, quote, reasonable and prudent measures, end quote, for proposed agency actions. It is truly shocking how many Project 2025 ideas have infiltrated this bill. We cannot let extremism dictate our nation's policies. My amendment strikes each section that mirrors or expands on Trump's Project 2025 playbook. I urge my colleagues to reject extremism, vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. Obviously oppose Mr. Huffman's amendment, and also I want to say thank you to all the people who participated in the roundtables that we had. Thank you to Chairman Dan Newhouse of the Western Caucus for partnering on doing those roundtables. And it's amazing. I guess you can be in the same meeting and hear different things, but I never heard one single witness that we had come to those roundtables, including the one that I believe Mr. Huffman invited from the National Wildlife Federation, that wanted to do away with the Endangered Species Act, that wasn't sincerely there, focused on how we make the Endangered Species Act work better. And again, I thank all those folks who participated in it, and it was very informal or informational and educational. What Mr. Huffman's amendment does is it strikes everything in the bill except for 3 sections, and one of those sections Mr. Huffman is proposing to strike in another amendment. The amendment would completely undermine the intent of the legislation. It would leave things in the current status quo, failing stature that it's in right now. It's really not a serious effort to improve either the ESA or the amendment nature of a substitute that's before us. I encourage my colleagues to oppose the amendment. I yield back my time, and I will ask if there's any further debate on the amendment. Mr. Graves, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we're effectively, as the United States Congress, we're effectively the board of directors for America, and we're supposed to be taking these jobs seriously. We're supposed to be acting in the best interest of this country. And to sit here and watch this place just completely devolve into fiction. I mean, so if that's the standard that we use now, should I just sit here and say that that in Cuba they don't respect human rights, that Maduro is against religion and putting people in jail for fun, political prisoners, that in China Xi absolutely uses child and slave labor, and that my socialist Democrat friends are totally on board with that. That's what they'd like to see in the United States. Like, is that where we are? Is that where we are right now? Is that I've watched for years as every single hearing that we have, that my friend from California comes in and just says the same things that are completely debunked. I'm glad y'all are leaving, because there's so many more things you could be doing with your time that are more productive than this. Maybe so. And so it just every single week we come in here, the same exact comments that are made, that you can put up fact after fact, report after report, and they're disproven, but doesn't stop them. And so this is where we are. Board of directors for the country just gets to come in here and sit here and make such a mockery, such a joke out of this place, that they can just say whatever they want, that there's no standard of truth, no standard of fact that's relevant here. So we're just going to sit here and just say that I'll do it too, if that's where we are. If that's where we are in this Congress, then I'm going to sit here and just say that my socialist Democrat friends do not want anybody to be able to have any religion, do not want freedom of speech, do not want people to be able to exercise free thought independence, do not want people to be able to choose who they want to vote for. They absolutely support. They support, they advocate for foreign interference in elections, because they just opened the borders. And they're refusing. Just yesterday, my friends across the aisle, every single one of them voted against a law that would prevent illegal aliens, citizens of other countries, from being able to vote here. They did. Every single one of them did. And they fully support folks being able to vote in their home country and then vote here as well. How many of you Americans get to vote in 2 different countries? Get to just expand your influence all over the globe. But my friends across the aisle, every single one of them voted to advocate for and to allow for folks of other countries to be able to vote here as well, advocating for foreign interference in elections. I mean, this place has become a complete joke, especially this room. And that this is complete fiction that occurs in here. And to watch people sit here and create false narratives, completely factless, baseless claims and then try and legislate on them? This is frightening. We had millions and millions of people that died for this country, that died for the rights that we have, and we're going to watch that just be completely disrespected by the devolution of this place. I think it's absolutely disgusting. So to my social democrat friends that don't want anybody to be able to go to church and don't want anybody to be able to have guns and don't want anybody to be able to vote because y'all just decide who wins elections, or maybe you want citizens of China to decide who our president is, or maybe you want folks from Russia to decide who our president is. I disagree with you.
Mr. Chair, we crossed the line on taking down words a long time ago.
We crossed the line a long time ago. That's right. If my friend
If the gentleman wants to withdraw his violations of the rules,
The committee will come to order. The gentleman from Louisiana
If my
will
friend-
suspend.
he has to suspend. His words should
it's-
either be taken down or he should apologize for them and withdraw them.
Mr. Chairman, I did not say anyone's name. I said if
He
my
spoke to our
if my
intense-
friend
The gentleman from
if my
Louisiana's
friend
Tom.
is saying that he's a socialist
Debate is not
Democrat,
in order, Mr. Chairman.
Order, the gentleman from California will suspend.
Everybody take a deep breath. The committee will come to order. The gentleman from California will suspend. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for the remainder of his time.
Mr. Chairman, I am willing
Mr. Chairman,
to.
I have not withdrawn my request.
Did you make a formal request?
I do. I demand that his words be taken down unless he's willing to accept that he just crossed about 100 committee rules and withdraws them.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't mention anyone's name, with the exception of the vote yesterday. I said socialist Democrats. If my friend from California is saying he's a socialist Democrat, and then I'll entertain looking at the transcript and deciding if I crossed the line or not.
Debate is not in order.
Mr. Chairman, debate is not in order. We heard the gentleman malign the intent of Democrats as not wanting anyone to have religion or free thought or being socialist.
No,
I mean,
no. If
there were
my
100 ways
friend-
in which he,
If my friend is saying, I did not name anyone's name. If my friend is saying he's a socialist Democrat, then I will look at the transcript and I will consider rescinding my words. If my friend is saying that when I said socialist Democrats, then that's him. Then I'll look at that and decide if I crossed the line or not, and consider withdrawing my words.
we can look at the transcript.
He needs to make the demand.
You have to make the demand.
You've made it. Do you want to throw it, or do you want to just?
I would prefer to just have a modicum of civility and comity from the gentleman from Louisiana.
My friend from California, I agree with you. And you are my friend. You are my friend. I like you a lot personally, I do. As
And
you
I
both
like you a lot,
discussed,
despite
we
the fact that
both-
you've just waxed self-righteous about making a mockery of this committee, and you're the guy that did an amendment
The
to put
committee will come to
Cajuns as
order.
a
The
listed
gentleman from
species under the
California
ESA.
will
So it's a
suspend.
little rich. It's a little rich.
Do you wish to continue on, or?
Look, Mr. Graves, can we just raise the level a little bit and continue on?
I just want to make sure I heard you. You said, can we? Can we?
Oh,
Is that
and I
what you
meant
just
it.
said? You said we.
The royal we. The royal we.
Mr. Huffman, my friend, if we are going to raise the level of civility in this room, I'm in, my man. I am absolutely in. So are we going to raise it? Are we?
We requires you.
Are we? Are we going to raise it? Because if we are, then I'm in. I'd love to sit here and debate policy and fix real stuff.
I promise on my side I will not stoop to the level that you just did.
Okay, the gentleman
you're
has
already there.
17 seconds left. Would you like to continue your 17 seconds?
All right, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment that declares unicorns endangered species and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Mr. Graves, are you okay? I'm good. I'll yield. This place is very frustrating, and I agree with you about it. And I get frustrated a lot too. But I really was taken in your remarks that as passionate as they were, none of them pertained to the Endangered Species Act. And so while those may be frustrations that you legitimately feel, and I certainly have a lot of frustrations in this moment with this body, with the state of our democracy, with where we are, I would ask that, given that we're all trying to just get through this Congress, that if you have things to share today, that you share them on the, in my opinion, bad, maybe in your opinion, good bill that we're going to have. And if you need a hug, I'm here. I will yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Huffman.
I want to associate myself with the gentlelady's room. I'll give Mr. Graves a hug too if he wants one. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, designated Huffman number 1. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not adopted.
Request a recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment designated Huffman number 1 will be postponed. I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Huffman number 2. Without objection, the amendment is considered read.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Endangered Species Act requires that agencies and project applicants must take reasonable and prudent measures to minimize impacts to threatened and endangered species. One form of reasonable measures is mitigation. Mitigation is critically important as a tool for allowing projects to move forward in a way that doesn't jeopardize threatened and endangered species. Compensatory mitigation isn't a new thing or a hard concept to grasp. One common example is restoring impacted habitat. If a proposed project will impact habitat in one area and this outcome is unavoidable, then the project applicant should have to restore habitat in a different location so that the threatened species is unharmed. This is common sense policy, and it happens a lot. We see it with the endangered desert tortoise, where projects include land acquisition and restoration. The Hawaiian hoary bat, with projects that restore existing habitat range outside of the project area. The western snowy plover, where projects engage in predator control as a mitigation technique. However, the legislation before us today removes mitigation as a reasonable and prudent measure that federal agencies or project applicants can take. Honestly, this provision has enormous potential to backfire on project applicants. Currently, the consultation requirement under Section 7 of the ESA is not stopping projects from moving forward. In fact, between 2008 and 2015, none of the 88,290 consultations recorded by the Fish and Wildlife Service resulted in a stopped or extensively altered project, and less than 2% of consultations failed to meet the 135-day time frame allowed without a mutual extension. This will not be the case if we've removed mitigation as a reasonable and prudent measure. Doing so means that there will be fewer tools in the toolbox for preventing jeopardy to a species. If the only options are either harm an endangered species or stop a project from developing, then unfortunately projects will have to be stopped. Mitigation isn't an added layer of difficulty that bureaucrats are trying to use to weigh down projects, but it could be the difference between a project being able to move forward or being shut down. My amendment brings back a little common sense to this mess. It says that we need to allow mitigation as an option if, without that option, the species is likely to go extinct. If mitigation will make the difference between life and extinction, then it needs to be on the table. Let's try to focus on the goals of the ESA, to save species, not the goals of developers and oil executives who are trying to have impunity, who are trying to pass the buck by not mitigating the consequences of their actions. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. Oppose the amendment. Title V of this bill was included to rein in the regulatory abuse that administration and agency officials are continuing to carry out, and in their latest attempt to require mitigation through the ESA Section 7 permitting process. The purpose of Section 7 is clear. It is about minimizing the impacts to listed species and critical habitat, not mitigating or offsetting every impact. For example, Section 7 states that the federal action agency and project proponents must give a biological opinion that specifies those reasonable and prudent measures that the Secretary considers necessary or appropriate to minimize such impact. It does not mention requiring mitigation or offsets, although that could be part of the biological opinion. The language proposed by Mr. Huffman would also be ripe for abuse by allowing any administration to subjectively require mitigation or offsets under the guise that without it, extinction would be guaranteed. I would also argue that this amendment is unnecessary, as Section 7 clearly states that federal agencies must ensure their actions are not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of a species before reaching the stage of issuing an incidental take statement that includes reasonable and prudent measures. In the scenario laid out by Mr. Huffman's amendment, where a single agency action could cause extinction to listed species, the services would be duty-bound under the ESA to levy a jeopardy opinion, stopping a project dead in its tracks, and propose alternatives before reaching the stage of the permitting process this section of the bill addresses. The amendment, I believe, is not only unnecessary, but I think it's also misguided. I encourage my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? There's no further discussion on the amendment. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, designated Huffman number 2. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Recorded vote.
A recorded vote, or the noes have it. Look, you didn't catch me in my slip up there.
Oh.
But since you asked for a recorded vote, further recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment designated Huffman number 2 will be postponed.
I had you too.
It's just that constant, you thought you're just going to go against me. Yeah. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Huffman number 8. Without objection, the amendment is considered read. Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This legislation is not simply tweaking the ESA to make it work better. The legislation pierces the core of the ESA, and Section 308 of the bill is really the tip of the spear. Section 303, rather. 303 would eliminate judicial review of species delisting decisions for 5 years after the species is delisted. Now, it takes a lot of resources and management to get a threatened or endangered species to the point where we can consider it recovered and actually remove it from the endangered species list. To qualify for delisting under the ESA, scientists must look at the 5 factors and make a determination as to whether recovery has occurred. Specifically, they must consider whether any of these factors continue to increase the species' risk of decline and extinction. So here are the factors: recovery goal achievement across a significant portion of the species range, habitat destruction, overutilization of the species, disease or predation, regulatory and recovery efforts by the states that would take over management of the species if it were delisted, and other factors threatening the species' existence. And as is the practice across the federal government, the Fish and Wildlife Service must consult with tribes. Once a species has been delisted, it goes through a 5-year monitoring period where the federal agencies and states ensure that the species has been recovered to the point that measures provided pursuant to the ESA are no longer necessary. This bill amends the ESA, though, to ban judicial review of delisting decisions during that whole 5-year period. It makes absolutely no sense. Judicial review is a critical tool that holds the Fish and Wildlife Service and NMFS accountable to the American people. Without any judicial oversight, the services could write a 1-sentence rule: species X has recovered, and we're removing it from the endangered species list. No matter how few individuals are left, no matter how close to extinction it may be, how grave the threats to the species are, a future administration could sidestep all of the science and considerations and simply delist a species with virtually no consequences. Talk about extreme. If you're serious about making the ESA, quote, work better, stop trying to ban judicial review. It undermines the entire argument that natural resources Republicans just want to tweak the ESA but not burn it down. I urge my colleagues to adopt my amendment, which would remove this harmful provision from the bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Stauber, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in opposition to the amendment offered by my colleague from California. Mr. Huffman's amendment is simply meant to derail one of the most important reforms put forth in this bill the bill's judicial review reforms. Rather than fix and prevent the ongoing vicious cycle of litigation that is helping to keep species after species listed under the ESA long after they have recovered, this amendment will continue business as usual. If this amendment is passed, out-of-touch extreme environmental groups will continue to weaponize the judicial system, ignore the science, and keep species listed indefinitely. This amendment does nothing to help the species the ESA was designed to protect. This amendment will simply line the pockets of coastal elite trial attorneys who have created a niche industry suing to keep recovered species on the threatened or endangered list forever. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing this amendment, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Ms. Porter, you're recognized.
I don't understand why Republicans who hold themselves out as the party of rights and of liberty are trying to block Americans from having access to the courts. They're a fundamental part of our government. We have a three-part government, and the right to go to the courts to seek to have a review of executive action is sort of a core part of checks and balances. So I feel like I'm back to sort of Schoolhouse Rock and the basics of civics. The only purpose I can understand for blocking judicial review is some kind of efficiency argument. But that is an argument about how our courts run, not one for Congress to be making. The courts have lots of mechanisms to dismiss frivolous lawsuits, to dispense with things quickly. So I guess I think all Americans, regardless of where they stand on the Endangered Species Act, regardless of what they think of any particular decision to list or delist any species, shouldn't want their rights to go and have the administrative branch checked by the judiciary to be taken away. We've spent a lot of time this year listening to Republicans lament, to be gentle, maybe complain, disparage decisions made by the Biden administration. So here, you're trying to prevent Americans from being able to complain to the courts about an action by the administration. It doesn't make sense to me. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. I also rise in opposition to the amendment. I want to stress that the underlying bill does not prohibit judicial review. What it does is it delays judicial review until after the 5-year monitoring period is complete. It actually gives the process outlined in the Endangered Species Act an opportunity to work. It also does not change the ability for citizens to file a listing petition nor an emergency listing petition if they feel that is necessary. I have often referred to the ESA in its current condition as Hotel California because it's easy for a species to get listed, but it's nearly impossible for them to get off the list. By prohibiting judicial review during the 5-year monitoring period, again, this is 5 years after the species been delisted, it would allow the collection of real-world data to show how a species is faring post-delisting. This will also allow the merits of the status of a species to be focused on the health of the species itself, not the whims of judges. An example of this is the ongoing court battle on whether to reinstate the Trump administration's rule to delist the gray wolf. In 2022, a district court judge vacated the rule based on a misinterpretation of the ESA in his view that more bureaucratic red tape was needed before wolves could be delisted. But don't just take my word for it. The Biden-Harris administration just last week submitted a brief to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals arguing that the Trump delisting should be reinstated and that the district court's ruling was wrong on too many counts to name. I ask unanimous consent to add this brief to the record without objection.
Without objection.
So ordered. And I'll close with a fact that my friends seemingly don't want to acknowledge, which is that no species has ever been delisted has ever been relisted due to a decline in the health of the species. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, designated Huffman number 8. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And the amendment is not adopted.
Recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment designated Huffman number 8 will be postponed. I recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Porter number 4 revised. Without objection, the amendment is considered read. Ms. Porter, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Science is impartial and serves as an objective way to help inform decision-making. It functions through rigorous methodologies, strict standards of quality, and peer-reviewed processes. When we trust the steps that the science went through to produce a result, then we can trust the result, regardless of where it came from. Currently, the services have not defined the term best available scientific and commercial data, but they do have guidelines they follow when evaluating and considering data. I would like to read the first 2 of the 7 policy points they use to guide their data use. 1, it is the policy of the services to evaluate all scientific and other information used to ensure that it is reliable, credible, and represents the best scientific and commercial data available. And 2, the second standard, gather and impartially evaluate biological, ecological, and other information disputing official positions, decisions, and actions proposed or taken by the services. This means that the science underpinning listing and delisting decisions for endangered species is and will continue to be high quality. Objective, impartial consideration of all the evidence is the cornerstone of making science-based decisions. Unfortunately, the bill that Republicans have introduced today, the Amended Species Act Amendments Act of 2024, tries to tip the scales of what data should be included and considered. The bill would require the best scientific and commercial data available to include, quote, such data submitted to the secretary by a state, tribal, or county government. But under the current and historical working policy of the services, data from state, tribal, and county governments are already included in the Endangered Species Act Best Available Science. So then what would this change accomplish, you ask? Under the Republicans' new definition, data from state, tribal, or county governments must be included regardless of the quality of the science that went in to produce it. If a state provides data to the service saying there are thousands of an endangered species within their state to try to tip the scales toward delisting, it must be included, even if that data is in complete disagreement with scientific consensus, if it wasn't produced according to rigorous scientific standards, if it wasn't peer-reviewed, regardless of whether it fits reality. Republicans may argue that other data sources beyond just what is submitted by the state, county, and tribal governments could be included and considered too, and that's correct. But that ignores the fact that under this proposed Endangered Species Act Amendments Act, these specific data sources must be included regardless of quality. So I'm offering this amendment to bring back a bit of objective science into the definition. My amendment would require state, tribal, and county data to be collected and analyzed in accordance with the universal standards of data collection, in accordance with scientific processes. It's imperative that no matter where it comes from, data informing government's decisions is of the highest quality and is free from political interference or bias. Otherwise, we risk undermining a species listing, delisting, and management decisions. I urge my colleagues that we adopt this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? I recognize myself. I oppose this amendment, although I don't oppose everything that the gentlelady said about the amendment. I'm a huge proponent of using the best available science, of that science being rigorous. But under the current system, and I think what it comes down to is who is the arbitrator of what is good science. The current system leaves that in the hands of a bureaucrat, and it oftentimes, a federal bureaucrat, excludes states, local governments, and tribes from having a seat at the table and presenting their scientific research. And that's what the status quo would be. In no way are we trying to minimize the impact of having, or the ability to have quality science go into these decisions. We're actually trying to open this up so that we can get broader views presented and actually give the people who are closest to these issues geographically a seat at the table, and possibly a broader discussion with more evidence than just simply saying we're going to trust the federal bureaucrat to make the decision on what's good science and what's bad science, and we'll take your science, or we're not going to take your science, but we may take some other science. Let's make it fair, let's make it transparent, and let's allow everybody to have a seat at the table. Section 6 of the ESA already requires federal cooperation with states, and it says to the maximum extent practicable in listing decisions. But again, that leaves the decision up to the bureaucrat. State and local and tribal governments are well equipped to productively participate in listing decisions. However, we know that federal participation with these state and local governments doesn't always happen. Despite the expertise and willingness of state, local, and tribal governments to participate in the ESA process, the Secretaries of the Interior and Commerce are not required to disclose to them the scientific information that they use on the basis of making listing decisions. The secretaries are also not required to utilize data generated by the state, local, and tribal governments, even though they have data federal agencies oftentimes lack. The underlying legislation clarifies that the best scientific and commercial data available for ESA listing decisions include data from those closest to the ground and most impacted by the listings. And again, that's the state, the local, and the tribal governments. The amendment is another attempt at centralizing power with unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats who will pick and choose what data meets the standard set by this amendment. I, for one, don't think that federal agencies need any more discretion. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the question on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, designated Porter number 4, revised. We will then vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Record a vote, please.
A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment designated Porter number 4 revised will be postponed. I recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, for the purpose of offering an amendment designated Porter number 7. Without objection, the amendment is considered read, and the floor is yours, Ms. Porter.
This spring, we were reminded that not all states are willing to take over the responsible stewardship of endangered species once they are delisted, especially if these species are labeled predators. In March of this year, a man in Wyoming used a snowmobile to hunt down a wolf, strike and maim the animal with the snowmobile, and then muzzle the maimed wolf with duct tape, dragging it into a bar to show it off, letting it suffer before taking it out to kill it and discard the body. His punishment? A $250 fine, not for the gruesome abuse of an animal, but for wrongful possession of live wildlife. Wolves in Wyoming can be hunted year-round without a license. and the identity of the hunter who kills the wolf is protected by state law. And hunting down the wolf and purposely hitting it with a vehicle, that is also considered hunting in Wyoming. States have legalized the hunting of wolves under the guise of predator control. With this designation, malice toward wolves is precluded from animal cruelty laws, and this has led to disgusting acts of torture and abuse. House Republicans love to point to state management as the solution to the biodiversity crisis, and I think we can all agree that we should celebrate when species are successfully recovered and management is returned to the states. But right now, it looks like we need a few guardrails on that transition back to state management. My amendment would prohibit killing predators with motor vehicles in the 5 years after they are delisted from the Endangered Species Act. I would hope that we can all agree that running over animals with cars or snowmobiles shouldn't count as hunting. I urge the adoption of my amendment, and I yield back.
The lady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Ms. Hageman, you're recognized.
As stated in its name, the Endangered Species Act does not govern predators, but instead protects species that meet the 5 listing criteria set forth under the Act. Wolves do not meet the criteria for being listed as endangered or threatened in the state of Wyoming. Listed species are already protected in the ESA from the incident described in this amendment, as it would be considered a take under the definition of the statute if it actually applied. This is an unserious amendment seeking to elevate one rare instance of poor behavior to a national issue of which it is not. It also seeks to improperly expand the authority of the federal government, as it is the states who are more than capable of handling instances of animal mistreatment. Some states already have these types of bans in place, and even for those states who don't have explicit bans on this activity, there are other actions these states can take to deter or punish certain behavior. Calls to elevate this policy at the federal level were spurred most recently by an incident which occurred in my state. While I do not condone the behavior, I do take offense with the suggestion that Wyoming neglected to act or is incapable of doing so. Wyoming Game and Fish Department law enforcement responded to the incident, and the individuals charged pled guilty and was fined. Game and Fish also commented that it was an isolated incident, and in fact, it is so isolated that this one incident received national and international attention. And even still, the state legislature created a treatment of predators working group that continues to operate. This is a predator management issue which is best handled by the states, and others should respectfully stay out of our state and allow our capable authorities to handle this situation versus pursuing this bad policy for the sake of action. And even if we accept the principles that the federal government needed to act, which we don't, this amendment and a similar bill are poorly drafted and show a complete disconnect and misunderstanding about the realities of living in places like Wyoming, in the wild or among wildlife. I would be curious to know how we assess whether an action that resulted in the death or injury to a predator was taken, quote, intentionally when it occurs in remote Wyoming, where there are no bystander street cameras or other evidence around. This amendment also doesn't reflect the reality that vehicles are often used for wildlife management activities and other justified exceptions. Again, this is an unserious amendment backed by radical activist groups trying to use an isolated incident to consolidate more federal power to weaponize as yet another tool in the larger war on the West. I oppose this amendment, request that my colleagues do as well, and I yield back.
The lady yields back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, sometimes a picture really does paint 1,000 words. And when you see that picture of that person just displaying such incredible cruelty, it also speaks to this wrong-headed vilification of predators that is a way of thinking that creeps into the debate and the legislation that we see in this committee over and over and over again. It is deeply ignorant. It ignores science. It is just wrong in every way. Animal cruelty should never be tolerated. I don't find this amendment by Ms. Porter particularly controversial. I would hope that all my colleagues here would agree with it, but apparently they don't. Unfortunately, we have seen some heinous things happen in the past year in Wyoming. We have this gentleman using a snow machine to run down a wolf, muzzle it, and show it off to his buddies in the bar before killing it. And we have local authorities giving him a slap on the wrist. The images from that night are disturbing. And when we brought up this situation in Wyoming on the floor, multiple members from the other side of the aisle denounced using snowmobiles as a means of hunting. That's good. This amendment should be an easy choice for us to make today. We should see plenty of Republicans wanting to support this amendment. We shouldn't allow the killing of predators with motor vehicles during the monitoring period, the critical, fragile monitoring period, after they have been delisted from the ESA, a time when we want to keep an eye on things, make sure that they're not trending back toward extinction. Once a species is removed from the list, the first few years are critical to ensuring that the species can continue to recover. If we allow people to use motor vehicles to intentionally run down freshly recovered species for sport or cruelty or whatever, then we throw away years of hard work, resources, and time that was spent putting these species on the path to recovery. I support this amendment offered by Representative Porter, and I urge my colleagues to adopt it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? I recognize myself. I oppose this amendment. The Endangered Species Act, as one may deduce by its name, is not about protecting predator species, but about protecting species that meet the 5 listing factors set out under the Act. And in regards to the picture that Ms. Porter put up, as a sportsman, as a lifelong hunter and outdoorsman, I'll say that's despicable. It's totally unacceptable, and there's no place for that. But I'll also point out that that's one isolated incident, and it doesn't rise to the level of creating federal law on using snowmobiles to hunt. I don't think that's a widely accepted practice. But this amendment is not about preventing avoidable relistings. This is particularly true with the gray wolves, which are thriving across the range, and it's a fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the Biden-Harris administration has argued in court. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the amendment? If there's no further discussion on the amendment, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, designated Porter number 7. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Further proceedings on the amendment designated Porter number 7 will be postponed.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, could I do unanimous consent, please, on a letter that we just received from apparently dozens of advocacy groups and nonprofits opposing the legislation before us today?
Without objection?
Yeah, thank you.
So ordered. Pursuant to the markup notice, it is now in order to consider H.R. 8704 to require the Secretary of Commerce to establish a grant program to foster enhanced coexistence between ocean users and North Atlantic right whales and other large cetacean species or whales. Without objection, the Subcommittee on Water, Wildlife, and Fisheries is discharged from further consideration of the bill. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Does any member wish to be recognized for purpose of debate on the bill? Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we are here again debating the fate of the North Atlantic right whale, a species that by any analysis is teetering on the brink of extinction. The North Atlantic right whale is one of the Earth's most endangered large whale species. Fewer than 356 individuals are left. I made the joke a few years ago when there were 420 left that there were more members of Congress than North Atlantic right whales, and that grim joke is even truer today. Unfortunately, the data shows that the current regulations are insufficient to keep human-caused whale deaths below the level required by law. Far too many whales are dying each year from human causes, and vessel strikes are a leading cause of injury and mortality. Since 2017, 142 North Atlantic right whales have experienced death or serious injury. 23 of those cases, which includes 15 deaths, have been caused by vessel strikes. Just this year, 4 whales have likely been killed by vessel strikes, even though there is a vessel speed rule already on the books. Unfortunately, scientists believe that these strikes were caused by boats under this current rule's 65-foot length. So the vessel speed restrictions would not apply to that vessel. Remember, scientists believe 3 times as many whales die by vessel strikes than what we can actually confirm. Mothers and calves are the future of North Atlantic right whales, but they are also the most vulnerable to vessel strikes because they spend most of their time near the surface. There are only 70 breeding females left, and if that number shrinks further, the North Atlantic right whale faces functional extinction. Something has to be done to save this whale before the only chance that the next generation will get to see these whales is in the history books. Luckily, we have a promising solution in the proposed seasonal vessel speed rule, which we anticipate will reduce strikes by an impressive 80 to 90%. By law, NOAA must do more right now to limit whale deaths. The proposed rule makes common sense changes to the 2008 rule that will help stabilize and recover North Atlantic right whale populations. The bottom line, too many whales are dying from vessel strikes and entanglements, so it is time to let NIMPS do its job. Let them finalize a rule that will protect whales while minimally impacting recreational boaters and local economies. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? I recognize myself, and I'm speaking in support of H.R. 8704, which would prevent NOAA from finalizing their amendments to the North Atlantic right whale vessel strike reduction rule. And let's start with the obvious. No member of this committee seeks to harm an endangered species like the North Atlantic right whale. However, in August of 2022, NOAA proposed a dramatic expansion of this rule to vessels as small as 35 feet. We've repeatedly heard from stakeholders that this expansion would cause tremendous harm to the nation's ports, recreational industries, and the manufacturing and retail industries that support outdoor recreation. Representative Carter's legislation would keep the current rule from 2008 in place through 2030, providing certainty to ocean users and avoiding safety concerns NOAA's proposal has generated. And I believe in Mr. Huffman's testimony, he stated that there's been vessel strikes even under this rule. So maybe the rule wouldn't be the solution, but Mr. Carter's bill would create a new grant program administered by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to develop technologies and best practices to reduce harmful interactions between ocean users and the North Atlantic right whale. I want to thank Representative Carter for the work that he's done to ensure that we're effectively protecting marine mammals like the North Atlantic right whale while balancing the interest of our many ocean users. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back. Is there further discussion on the bill? If there's no further Mr. Stauber, you're recognized.
Mr. Chair, I want to make some comments on the bill real quick. I think that I support the underlying bill. I think that it has been well thought out. When we talk about the ESA and what it can do for the species, I just want to direct my comment to Representative Porter. That picture, as Mr. Huffman rightfully says, is worth 1,000 words, is despicable. And I want you to know that as Representative Hagman said, that's a unique situation. That's the exception, unfortunately. And I just want to be able to, go back to that and say that should have never happened. And again, as the chair said, it's despicable. I do want to look at some of the other actions involving the ESA, including this bill. I will tell you that when we have, when we're discussing the ESA, and we're talking about only 3% of the species has come off. Listen, Mr. Chair, you brought up the gray wolf earlier in your comments. The gray wolf has recovered in Minnesota. We know it has. The recovery has been exceptional, and that should be for us. That should the ESA. We should celebrate the recovery of the gray wolf. And so I am, as you alluded to earlier, I am very proud that the gray wolf soon should be delisted and allowing the states to manage the gray wolf. It's particularly interesting that the Biden administration, on their way out, now are supporting the science, which dictates the delisting of the gray wolf. And so I think it's important that we recognize some very good things are happening on the ESA, but we must not allow the weaponization of the courts. And I think it's important to also look at the, have the ability to have discussions like we're having today. There are going to be good, healthy debates, and I think that good, healthy debates in this committee are serve us well in ultimately getting some good legislation forward. So I'm in favor of Representative Carter's bill, and Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the bill? Seeing
Mr.
none,
Chairman,
is,
Mr. Chairman.
oh, Ms. Peltola, you're recognized.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Recreational boating supports almost 3,500 jobs in Alaska and adds nearly $750 million annually to our state's economy. Alaskans care deeply about outdoor recreation, and I'm proud to be co-chair of the Congressional Boating Caucus, which helps support access to boating education and opportunities. As Alaskans know all too well, the ocean is an unpredictable environment. Educating new mariners about boating safety and respecting the ocean, including understanding how to operate vessels in rough conditions, is critical. NOAA's proposed vessel speed rule was brought with good intentions. The North Atlantic right whales are in trouble, and like many of my colleagues, I'm concerned about the long-term health of our marine mammal populations, including the right whale. As part of the rulemaking process, NOAA engaged with the private sector to address their concerns and learn about developments in AI, camera systems, and other forecasting tools to help detect whales more effectively. Unfortunately, NOAA has a habit of ignoring private sector advancements and instead relies heavily on in-house developments, but that is very short-sighted. I hope that this bill will help protect endangered whales and ensure boaters' safety on the water, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there further discussion on the bill? There's no further discussion on the bill. It is now in order to consider amendments to H.R. 8704. This time, we're going to recess the committee until 1:15. We'll pick up where we're leaving off.